Morning. Welcome everybody to this podcast for Dying Matters Week. Today we're absolutely delighted to have Tim Owens with us, one of the three dads walking, to talk to us about the experience he had of losing his daughter Emily. And welcome, Tim. It's really nice to meet you. I wondered if you'd just like to kind of kick off really with starting the conversation about what happened during COVID when you lost your daughter, very sadly.
Yeah, so Em was 19 when she died, and it was the week before the Prime Minister announced lockdown. Em was high-functioning autistic. She'd been diagnosed when she was 15, and after she got the diagnosis, she'd kind of built her life back up, and she'd been successful in getting some GCSEs and going to college and apprenticeship, and she was just working in our community pub in West Norfolk. And as kind of the lockdown approached, she was getting quite stressed about what was going on around the world. And the week before the Prime Minister announced lockdown, we start coughing in the house, so we have to isolate. We isolate on the Monday. On the Tuesday, Em starts to cough. She's quite happy at the moment at home. And then on the Wednesday morning, she wakes up very anxious, wants to go out, wants to go up to the coast with her in a little Mini. She used to drive a little red Mini around. But she was very anxious. Her work had gone because the job in the pub was going, because the pubs were closing. She used to go to the gym. That was her way of kind of de-stressing, coping with her autism, as was working in the pub. And her final freedom, if you like, was driving her car. And we denied her the opportunity to take a car up to the north coast of Norfolk. And sadly, she just went outside and tried to take her own life. And we found her about 15 minutes later. She went to hospital, and because we thought she had COVID, she had to go into a COVID isolation ward. The NHS didn't know how to deal, because it was the early days, no one knew how to deal with it. So the procedures weren't all in place for us to visit her. So she was that was on the Wednesday she tried to take her own life. On the Friday, we were finally allowed to see her, so 2 days without seeing her. And she'd been moved then onto the critical care ward rather than the COVID critical care ward. And the NHS staff were lovely, but they said there's very little chance of her surviving because there's no activity in her brain. And then they said, they told us that she'd signed up for the organ donation register when she was 12, which we were unaware of. She'd done that through school, and we then had to go through the organ donation process, which was in those absolutely horrendous times when we knew Em was going to die. That was a kind of pinprick of light, if you like. And the absolutely horrendous piece of it was that all the clinical staff, the theatres and everything, because of COVID, had all been disrupted. So the transplant process was massively disrupted. But she managed to donate several of her organs, including her heart, which was brilliant. And that was, as I say, in those horrible days, we turned the life support off, and we didn't. The hospital staff turned the life support off on the Sunday at lunchtime or 1 o'clock. And we held her as she died, and then they whisked her away to donate her organs. And that was us entering a whole world that we weren't expecting to. We just lost our 19-year-old daughter. And the following day, the Prime Minister announced the full lockdown of the country, which absolutely, those normal rituals that you have after you lose someone, they just got taken from under us. You know, the next few months were horrendous in terms of trying to navigate through. Just didn't know which way to turn to.
I can't possibly imagine what that period of time must have been like for you, Tim. Can you tell me a little bit about how the staff reacted to you and to Emily, and what that experience was like in terms of those things that you remember about that period in the hospital when you were allowed to visit her? I mean, it must have been dreadful not being able to visit her for those first couple of days, but what was that like?
The staff were lovely. We went into critical care, and I'd never been to see anyone in critical care that was unconscious, that was out of it. And the thing that I will always take away is the way they did her hair. It's lovely. That's got me going.
Sorry, Tim.
That's all right, no. But the care that they took over her was beautiful. Just didn't expect that at all. Just came and kept doing her hair. That was absolutely fantastic. And they were, and they broached the the idea of organ donation with us very quickly when we got in there, and they were almost, it felt like they might offend us by talking about organ donation, but it was something to focus on because we knew she was going to die. We got there on the Friday night and the consultant said, we're going to give her one more brain scan on the Saturday morning, but there is, less than 1% chance she's going to make it. So we'd kind of prepared ourselves, and they were talking about turning off the life support on the Saturday night, but because of the disruption to the transplant process because of COVID, they couldn't do that. So we had to kind of wait for another kind of 18 hours before they turned off the life support. And they were all so lovely with us and allowed us time with grandparents and things like that, which was lovely. And they really, they warned us about the transplant process, the fact that when we held her, when she died, she would be whisked away. As soon as she died, she'd be whisked away from us. So we were totally kind of prepared for that. So the wraparound, the care from the staff, and subsequently we've been in, the transplant team that looked after us. That whole transplant process, even the aftercare of the transplant process, was totally blown apart. The service where you go to the Order of St Merit for transplant for St John, that was all delayed because of COVID. Everything was impacted because of COVID, and the staff were just trying so hard to navigate around these rules that they didn't understand themselves, because this, it was totally unknown to us all. But the staff, bent the rules a little bit, allowed a few more visitors than perhaps they should. It's just little things like that, knowing the pressure they were under. And the staff were lovely. The staff were, at the time, the QE hospital, in King's Lynn, I think it was requires improvement. It'd been and we said to the staff, the care that they gave us and them was just, couldn't have asked for any better.
That must be a huge source of comfort for you, really, because it, as you said, those times were unprecedented, weren't they?
Absolutely.
So you were not only going through something that no one ever expects to have to deal with, but at a time where the whole world was turned upside down. And you must have felt so isolated.
We felt massively isolated, and subsequently I met I don't know what he does, but he's a member of the theatre staff who was in the theatre when donated her organs, and he sat with her after she donated her organs before they took her off to the mortuary, and we just by chance, through a friend of a friend, we met, we had a beer together. And he said he viewed Em as the first kind of victim of COVID that he came across, not a physical victim, but a mental health victim of COVID, because it was the COVID and the lockdown and the restrictions on her life that filled her stress bucket up and just sent her, she took a stupid option, but the worst option.
I think
I was just going to say that about your, the experience of the nursing staff. I think Joe and I are both nurses by background, and it's easy to forget sometimes the impact that you have on people, I think, when you're doing your job, as with anything, isn't it? So it's lovely to hear that the bit about the hair and about keeping her looking as she should, which is lovely to hear, because it's those little touches that obviously stick in your head and will stick in many other people's heads, particularly probably during the COVID time when there was limited visiting, that those visits then were even more precious.
And it was to see, because when she always got made up to go out and everything, she always did her hair, she never went out a mess. It's probably part of her autism. She wanted to look, and if she'd have been in hospital, she could have seen herself in hospital, if she'd been looking a mess, that would have upset her. It would have upset her. So to see the care, and washing, I just never experienced that before, the care that was being taken.
Yeah, it's lovely to hear, really. So it is important. Well, our appearance is important to most of us, isn't it? And I think we know when you're in hospital, you lose a lot of your identity because you are a patient. You lose whatever else you might be in your normal world. You become, as often people talk about, being institutionalized almost, isn't it, in hospital, that you take on that patient role. So that's really lovely to hear that, and I think it's a great sort of reflection to feed back to the staff, so they ever question what they're doing and the importance of it. It's particularly when sometimes it's our lowest paid workers that are providing that care, our healthcare assistants, and the value of that role is huge. You know, they provide such important care in looking after somebody and keeping them looking as they should. So I think that's a really lovely bit of feedback. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask you, Tim, how on earth did you navigate your way through that period of time afterwards, where there was a lot of unknown anyway, because of COVID, but also trying to deal with the loss that you'd experienced and not being able to share that with people because you couldn't see people?
So we live in a little village in West Norfolk, and the first thing was the community tried to rally round, but they weren't allowed to come and see us. They weren't allowed, you know. After Emma died, we kind of, on the Sunday, we went home and we were just obviously devastated, in pieces. I've got other children, you know, we were all in an absolute mess. And as the dad, you're meant to be able to guide your family. That's what dads do, isn't it? I haven't got a clue how to guide my family through this. Our huge concern in those, between them dying and the funeral, fortunately our neighbours were funeral directors. So Helen came round and said, do you want us to sort everything? It was like, yes, because she was trying to navigate that. So there were stupid things, not stupid, horrendous things, like we couldn't, after Em died, the last time we saw Em was in the hospital. We couldn't go and see her in a chapel of rest because we weren't allowed to, because of the COVID rules. There were only going to be 6 people at a funeral, which for a 19-year-old girl who'd grown up locally, you know, absolutely devastating. The community, because she'd grown up in our village, she'd been to school in our village, played football in our village, been to playgroup in our village, she'd worked in the pub in our village. She knew more people than we probably did, especially from working in the pub. So everyone in our community, it's about 550, 600 strong, our village. Everyone just kind of came round. And our big concern in between her dying and the funeral was if one of us got COVID, then we couldn't attend the funeral. So for 3 weeks, we pretty much locked ourselves indoors. We didn't go shopping or anything. And all of the community friends came and visited and dropped Sainsbury's or Tesco's or Lidl shopping outside the front door to try and protect us so we could go to her funeral. So that kind of care that we had, the big surprise to us, or the nightmare to us in that time, was we had no support from the normal people, the normal charitable sector people that you'd go to, just simply not because they didn't want to. They couldn't, because they didn't understand the COVID rules that they were operating within. Some of them tried to reach out through kind of Zoom or Teams, and that didn't really work very much. But we were in a mess as a family, a total mess. And I, as an individual, how did I navigate through that? I couldn't even breathe. I couldn't, you know, just those tasks to get up and make the kids breakfast or lunch or something like that was a nightmare. And I'm a bit into, I've done kind of quite a bit of management leadership stuff. And there was a guy that I'd seen a talk on called Admiral William McRaven. He's a senior American, who's retired now, Admiral. And he gives this bit of a leadership talk. It sounds a bit cheesy, but he has his 10 points of leadership about trying to get through hard times in life. He's an ex kind of US Navy Special Forces dude. And his first point is make your bed every morning. And that sounds really stupid. But I'd seen this talk way before Em died. And he says, if you get out of bed in the morning and you don't know what to do, if you can get out of bed and make it. Because if you do nothing else in the course of that day, when you go to bed in the evening, you'll see the bed that's made and you'll think, I've done something positive today. And genuinely, that's what I did to start the day off every day, was get out of bed, make our bed and make the kids' beds, just so that we got something, a bit of normal structure. And it sounds so stupid, but it really helped me. It set me off every day, because honestly, making the kids or making lunch or breakfast or whatever, the normal chores that you do without thinking about, became an absolute mountain. You just didn't know how to exist, but that really helped me to start with.
Isn't it interesting how something that would seem so trivial normally helped to get you through each day?
Yeah.
And build up your strength and resilience to try and deal with some of the challenges you were facing.
I think because at work I've been trained quite a lot and to deal with some pretty horrendous situations. Work are quite good at training. You know, you go into a job and they train you to do that job, whether it be the NHS or, you know, you're trained. But the thing that I hadn't been trained for this, and that was the whole point. I knew I hadn't been trained from it. And I think we'll come on to it probably a bit later, but I knew this was beyond my ability to cope with. This grief, this level of grief was just way beyond anything. And I knew I needed help. I didn't know where that help needed to come from, but it was almost, I need help. I've got to find somebody to give me that help. And I don't know who that is at the moment. And that help, well, you've got your friends and your family really close by. They all want to help because they put themselves in your shoes and they just think how horrendous it is. But sometimes you don't want to burden those people that are really, really close to you. So, you know, because the thought, it's just horrendous. And by reaching out, that was a great source of strength, not immediately, but just by almost having that, you know, help-seeking behaviour. I know I need help, and just admitting that I can't get through this on my own. I need support. I don't know where it's going to come from, and I'll try any avenue. And if that avenue doesn't work, I'll move on to the next one. But that was so important for me.
And I'm sure that for people watching this podcast, Tim, that taking that first step, they'll find it enormously helpful if ever they find themselves in a similar situation. What did you do?
So
how did you reach out?
I went to the charities. So some Mind and other charities through work. We reached out to them and just said help. Mind were brilliant. They've got a suicide bereavement worker who came round, and he was actually allowed to visit our house, and we were allowed to sit outside. Steve, an ex-police officer, not therapy, but just to talk about life really and how we're doing. So Steve was brilliant. There was another lady called Carol from another charity through work that came out. There was work chaplains that came out and just sat in the back garden with us, socially distanced, and just talked. And they were an incredible source of help. A lot of the charities were offering support via Zoom or via Teams. That we found that really, really hard. All of us did. To make that personal connection in that moment of grief was absolutely horrendous. And many of these are really, we've been recommended these charities, especially some of the children's bereavement charities. We've been recommended them, but it just didn't work for us, for our teams. We just needed to sit face to face with someone and look them in the eye and just sob with them, cry with them. You know what I mean? Just have that connection with them, which we found really, really difficult. So that support in our back garden, not from therapists or anything, but just from people who would listen and just talk to us was incredibly important. The other piece I said about that help-seeking behaviour, and it was after Em's funeral. So Em's funeral, 6 people there, you know, a 19-year-old girl. The streets of the village were lined when we went out. We took her to the crematorium, 25-minute service in the crem. And that was it. That was the end of it. That we didn't have. And it was the chaplain that I was talking about. He said, normally when you lose someone, you have all these rituals that you go through. They were all gone. There was no rituals. There was no wake. There was no, you know, support from the family or friends. We literally had a 25-minute service at the crematorium in King's Lynn. And 10 minutes later, we're back home, and that's it. And just devastated. I remember my wife saying, she was crying in my arms, just saying, no one will remember Em in a year's time. She's gone, you know, that's it. And that was kind of sowed a seed in my head. We're just like, no, they will somehow. I'll do something and they will remember Em in a year's time, because we've got to get some good out of this. I don't know what that is. I haven't got a clue. But it's almost like as a dad, I wanted to fight back a little bit. I wanted to do something positive. And then it was my eldest daughter. She, it was a week after Em's funeral, and she came to me and she said, Dad, I've been talking to this bloke in Manchester. Now, Annabelle, 21. So it's like, oh my word, what are you doing? She's really sensible. And Annabelle had connected with another young lady, another Emily, and that was Mike's daughter, one of the other 3 dads. And Mike's daughter, Beth, had taken her life. She was 17, taken her life a week after Em. And so through our kids, our surviving kids, we kind of connected. And it was dead on a month after Em died that I had my first conversation with Mike. And I've got to say, the peer support that the two of us gave each other was absolutely incredible. Just two dads in pretty similar, no one's in the same situation, all grief's different, but two dads who have just lost our teenage daughters within 5 days of each other to suicide. They think Beth took her life because she was an artist, a vocal artist, and all the venues were closing down and she just had a bit of a dip. And on the Friday night after Em died, on the Sunday, on the Friday night after Em died, Beth took her own life. And so Mike and I were able to talk quite openly as two dads who had lost our teenage daughters. And Mike was in a much worse pit of despair than I was. Mike was suicidal and he was going to take his own life. But somehow, just by the two of us talking and being on call, because we hadn't got that professional support that we normally have, we just agreed on our first conversation, if you're feeling down at whatever time of day or night, just give us a call, mate. And we did. We just spoke. We spoke daily to start with, and then it kind of went into kind of every other couple of days. But we'd phone each other at weird and wonderful times. And that peer support was absolutely incredible. It was key for both me and Mike to kind of talk about how we're feeling of kind of dads in families with surviving, you know, with wives, with kids who are all looking to you. You haven't got any answers, but you know, people are looking for you to try. Then your wives aren't looking for you to find answers, but you feel as though it's your role to try and help guide the family through this, and you just don't know where to go. So talking to someone in a similar situation was so powerful. And again, it just goes back to that, not bottling it up. And it's quite difficult for people sometimes, especially men, to go for that help-seeking behaviour and just not admit that they're themselves are in a state of crisis, you know, and that was incredibly powerful. And along the way, after Mike and I met and we spoke, there were various other people that we met who had lost their parents lost their children to suicide, and they were further down the line than us. Andy, for example, the other one of the three dads, he was 14 months ahead of us. So we reached out to him. How do you get there? How do you get from where we are in a state, you know, a month, 2-3 months after you've lost your daughter? How do we get to that 14-month point? There's another guy I reached out to who'd lost his son in 2013, and that was through my boss. And the only reason I connected with this other guy, a guy called Richard Bland, was I had a new boss, and I just went straight to my new boss and said, I'm in a right mess, my family in a right mess because of X. Because we've just lost them, blah, and explained what had happened. And he was like, oh my word, but he had happened to have done in a previous life some charity work. And he connected me to this guy, Richard, who had is now set up a charity. It wasn't a charity at the time. And he was kind of 7 years down the line from us. It's how do we get to there? So it's all about that seeking support and seeking help, because you can't cope with this on your own. You need help.
I think that's the one thing that's resonating with me, Tim, from what you're saying, is that if people can be brave enough to reach out through those connections, you and the other dads and the other people that you've met have all supported each other to get through something that you probably, or certainly your other colleague, felt that they wouldn't actually be able to get through.
Yeah, and I've read Mike's journal. He wrote a daily journal that he found really therapeutic after Beth had died, and he shared it with us. And yeah, that was quite powerful. The place he was in. He shared it because he wanted to explain where he couldn't explain it. He said, read this. But we on the two walks, that was the thing that surprised us. We met so many people, parents and brothers and sisters and all sorts of family members who'd lost someone to suicide, and so many of them were still caught in the moment. There's one lady in particular, I remember walking through Lancaster. She'd lost her son 11 years earlier, I think, and as soon as we met her, she was almost still caught up in that moment of grief. You never move on. That was one thing Mind taught me. You never move on. You just move forward. You take that person with you in some guise. And she was still caught up in the moment, and she'd lived like that for about 11 years. And she just told us a story. She hadn't been able to tell anyone her story and the story of her son. And that was so incredibly powerful because it was almost like unburdening her. There was another lady we met, and she's a friend from the village. Her dad had taken his own life in 1953, and it was all kind of very hushed, and she didn't know that. She was only 3 years old. When she was about 11, she was told dad had died. And then when she was later, she kind of put the jigsaw together. I think she was in her 30s, and she worked out that dad had taken his own life. And she'd hardly spoken to anyone about it. And then we met her. So 70 years on, we're talking quite openly about it. And grief, you need to talk about it. You can't bottle it up. You've got to talk about it. You've got to let it out. And we had so many people that we met. They'd be walking along. They'd be standing at the side of the road. They'd had their walking kit on. Oh, have you come to join us? Yeah. And then a few minutes later, why have you come to join us? And then they'd tell us all about their son, their daughter. And some of these heartbreaking stories, dads of 2 11-year-olds we met that had taken their own lives. And, we're all walking and crying as they tell us their stories. But a couple of hours later, they've unburdened all this stuff and we'd be laughing about stuff. So we've just gone from the most devastating, horrendous stories. And just by sharing that grief and sharing that pain can be really therapeutic.
I'm not quite sure how to carry on. It's amazing. Two things I was going to say was, I guess one of the elements about COVID is, in some ways, if COVID hadn't existed, perhaps your daughter would never have reached out digitally to find Emily and Beth, and that's because you would have had all the services supporting you. So I think it's really interesting that your daughter, as younger people do, using the internet or search things out, and how fortuitous that she did. And you got that wonderful friendship then with Mike, wasn't it, you said?
Yeah, Mike was the first dad I joined with. It's kind of irony really that COVID was the cause of them taking a death, but then COVID was the cause of us reaching out, and our surviving kids are the reason we all got together through our surviving kids. And it felt one of the great courses that I went on. It was about 6 months after Em died. I went on a mind course called the Anchor Project, and it's for loved ones who've been, it could be friends, loved ones, people that have lost somebody to suicide. And it was an 8-week course, an hour and a half long on a Thursday night, that was so powerful. And it just spoke, the facilitator, who was fantastic, just spoke about all the emotions, because grief after suicide is so complex, because as well as the normal kind of emotions you feel with grief, there's a huge amount of guilt, there's blame, there's anger there that perhaps you don't get with other types of grief, especially the guilt. What did I do wrong as a dad? I couldn't, you're there as a mum and dad to bring your child into the world. You failed to do that. You've totally failed to bring your, so the guilt can be all consuming. And the course, the Anchor Project, wasn't therapy. It just literally went through all the different kind of emotions that you might feel after a suicide. And it was an incredibly powerful course, because there was a number of bereaved people there. All have got different stories. No stories are the same. But just being told how to navigate. And the important point that I took away was it's absolutely fine to feel any of those emotions. It validated feeling guilty, feeling anger towards how dare she have put the rest of our family through this. But what was really powerful was that not to get caught in any one of those emotions and get locked into it. So if you feel anger towards them, or if you feel guilt, then don't get locked in it. And it was really interesting, because we did meet people along the 2 walks who were locked in an emotion and that couldn't get out of it, and to the detriment of their own mental health. So that course was massively powerful, a really good course by Mind.
And I guess that I was going to say about that, it's lovely that when you've been doing your walking and you've had people talking to you, but actually that must be incredibly hard for the 3 dads, because you're taking on other people's emotions as well.
The charity PAPYRUS were really concerned about that, and they offered it, because we had no idea when we did our first walk. We had absolutely no idea that we were going to be met by so many bereaved people. the first person that met us was a lovely lady called Susanna, who was in her 70s. She'd lost her daughter, Polly. She was a consultant in the NHS. She'd lost her daughter just about the same time as us, and just a bit ahead of us. And she just came to walk, and this little old lady, she's tiny. She walked about 19 miles that day across the country, and we just spoke, and there were loads of people, and the charity had thought about it, and they were concerned about it, but to us it felt like we were helping other people and burden, and the three of us had already been through one of our worst nightmares, and it felt like if we could help other people get through their worst nightmares, then that was a good thing. And many of the people that we met on the way, we're still in contact with. And after we did the first walk, we obviously did the second walk, and many of the people that we met on the first walk either walked with us on the second walk. Some of them put us up overnight on the second walk, and there's a few that were quite powerful. There's one called Martin, who was a hardened Lancastrian farmer, in his and his daughter was a doctor as well, who'd taken her own life, and it was only 3.5-4 weeks after his daughter took her life that he came and found us out. He just suddenly appeared from nowhere. He got a big rugged staff, he's got a crooked leg, and he walked across the Forest of Bowland with us. And the BBC interviewed him, and he'd just come, a bit like we'd sought help, how do we get through this? He was doing exactly the same as these three dads. I've just found myself in a very similar situation. How can I get through it? And he walked with us all day. And he was in pieces, he really was a broken man. The following year, we stayed with him, and his life was cracky. No one's over it. You'll never get over it. But he'd moved forward with his life, and he was doing more. He was doing positive stuff. He hadn't. Always taken. It's Andy talks about. And his daughter Sophie, she was a nurse, 29-year-old nurse up in Scotland, and when Sophie died, about 14 months ahead of Emma and Beth, it was the local vicar came around to his house and said, "You'll always carry a Sophie-sized hole in you, but what will happen? You'll grow around it." So that's what, and I thought that was quite powerful. That the pain will never go away. You'll just learn to deal with it, and you'll take it with you in a positive way. And that's hopefully what the three dads have done, is try to use that pain in a positive way that helps other people.
By way of thinking, our time is ticking on this morning.
Yeah,
we've had a lovely chat with you, but I think before I ask you if there's anything else that you'd like to share with the people that are watching this recording, is how powerful the legacy is that you three dads have carried with you on your walks, and how many people you must have helped, and what a legacy that is to your daughters.
Yeah, it's quite the first one. I've got to tell you just one story. We've had emails from lots of people saying thank you, from grandparents, parents. They're pointing them towards PAPYRUS. That's the whole point. We didn't know about the charity. If we'd known about the charity, then maybe we or our daughters would have reached out, and maybe they would be here with us. But there was one, it's the first time we spoke at a Keswick Mountain Festival. This was early last year. And we spoke, we told our story after the first walk and where we were going. And there was a guy, loads of people, about 150, 200 people. The people came to see us afterwards. There was a guy who waited to speak to me. I was the first one he got to. And he just came up to me and he just looked me in the eye and said, "I come up to Cumbria to take my life today. And I saw your talk." Yeah, quite powerful.
Yeah. Very.
And then he donated a few days later, which was good. but he in turn hugged up all three of us and just said, after hearing our story, he couldn't go through with it because the pain that his family would go through. So massively powerful.
Absolutely. And maybe that's the note that we should end our recording on, just to say thank you very much to you, Tim, for sharing your experience with us, but also to thank you to all three dads. Because look at the positive impact that you've had across the country, and the amount of people that you've helped, and how out of something so tragic, something positive can come.
Yeah, that's got to be a good thing. Just helping other people. Yeah, just helping other people has got to be a good thing that comes out of it.
It's been a difficult conversation, but very, very powerful. I can't think of another word to describe it. And my heart goes out to all of you, and your families. It's just impossible to imagine how difficult the last few years have been for you all.
Yeah, but there's so many people in our situation. The suicide is so common across the UK, and the problem is because those individuals all die as a oner and they go below the radar.
Yeah,
they've had no voice, but hopefully we're giving them a bit of a voice, which is a good thing.